Right. I think I have to see the green bottom, but okay, we are live now. So, hello everybody, and welcome to our session Re-envisioning a Feminist Basic Income Framework. My name is Jessica Schulz. I'm a PhD candidate at the Freebies, the Frieburg Institute for Basic Income Studies. And we, the gender team of the Freebies, Almaz, Zelleke, Toru, Yamamori, Halpenny, and Clem, Davies want to discuss today in this panel the definitions of basic income from a feminist perspective. So before introducing our team members properly, I want to talk shortly about our idea of a feminist perspective. Our approach for basic income is discussed from an intersectional feminism, from women to structural gendered and other forms of oppression like class, race, disability, or sexual orientation. The intersectionality of feminism plays a crucial role in the question of equality and is also a central aspect of the history of feminism. So starting from fights for equal rights and participation, visibility and representation to the strikes of female workers in factories against miserable working conditions and low wages, which leads to an International Women's Day since 1914. Oh, can you hear me? Okay. One of the biggest strikes in this history of feminism, and seen as the starting point actually of the history of International Women's Day, is the Lawrence textile strike in 1912, which is also known as the Bread and Roses strike. And I'm saying that because the pamphlet Bread and Roses immediately reminded me of the claim of basic income, since a basic income goes also beyond the idea of a minimum basic security, which only ensures survival, but not a dignified, autonomous, and self-determining life. So it was first used by the activist Helen Todd a year before these strikes in her reports in American Magazine about her round trip through Illinois, where she claimed for women's rights to vote. In her articles, she distinguished between the bread of life, which was or is shelter, security, and safety, and the roses of life, like music, education, nature, and books. And in this way, she gives a broader perspective on the question what a dignified life actually requires. So to this day, there are numerous feminist socialist organizations under the name Bread and Roses, all over the world fighting against oppression and for equality. And the author Andrea Datri, who's also the founder of international women's organization Pani Rosas, which means Bread and Roses, also writes in her so-named book Bread and Roses, Gender and Class Under Capitalism, women do not constitute a separate class, but rather an interclass group. The class to which a person belongs determines the counters of their oppression. So in that context of women's fight for civil rights, the system of gender relations is part of a social order structured by intersectional power relations, connecting with economic and political questions, which a basic income framework should draw attention to. So what can we learn from these activists, suffragettes, and workers? How we can translate their critique and claims about a life that is not just nurtured with bread, but also with culture, education, and nature, or so to say with roses. And the question is, how can we integrate the idea of bread and roses in a basic income framework from a feminist perspective? So with the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen that we still live in domestic structures, which determines and organize not only women's living conditions and opportunities, but all socially disadvantaged, not fulfilling the predetermined role economy and society assigns them. So again, I want to quote Andrea Datri, who shows in her book how current the struggles of women activists, suffragists, and workers are to this day. She writes, "For women, there have been other specific consequences of the pandemic. The closure of schools, childcare, and recreation centers, as well as the conditions of quarantine itself, increase the burden of care-related tasks women take on at home. This has been even worse for women who are the sole support for their families, for those forced to continue working, for those who lost their jobs, and for women from the poorest sectors of society." So in line with this, with the theme of this year's Vienna conference, Crisis and Transformation, we can say that in the discussion about basic income, these women and feminist voices are not heard enough. So in order to add to the dialogue, we want to direct the attention to the desirability and design of a basic income framework from a feminist perspective. which leads me to the introduction of our first speaker, Clem Davies. She is a doctoral candidate in economics at the Götz Werner Chair of Economics Policy and Constitutional Economic Theory in Frieburg. In her PhD, she focuses on critically analyze some of the assumptions underlying economic theory and their policy impacts, and particularly applied to universal basic income. So her work focuses on the role of competition in German ordoliberalism from a feminist economic lens. And Clem, the stage is yours now.
Thank you, Jessie. All right. Wonderful. So the purpose of my contribution today is to show why and where our goal of defining a basic income from a feminist perspective is necessary by reviewing the existing literature. And throughout my contribution today, and I think I can speak for my colleagues here when we're talking about women and men, we're talking about gender and not sex, but I acknowledge the limitations of the gender binary that I'll be using today. I'll start with a little quote. So why do we need a feminist basic income? Well, we hear from Von Paris and Vanderbrot. They say that under practically any imaginable basic income reform, women would benefit far more than men, whether in terms of income or in terms of life options. I disagree with this, and I'm going to show you a little bit why, hopefully, in the next 10 or 15 minutes. So coming back to why do we need a feminist basic income? Recently, I was talking with a professor, and I expressed to him that I was interested in looking at the gendered aspects of UBI, and he responded, that's why I love UBI. It's universal. It treats everyone the same. And then that was the end of the conversation. It was over, and there was no more to be said on the matter. And in my short career in UBI, I've seen that a lot of people share this view that a UBI, being universal, unconditional, individual, etc., is gender neutral. But often this does imply androcentric perspectives, given the background of our institutions and our academies, and it doesn't necessarily include a feminist or a gender inclusive perspective. So why do we need a feminist basic income? Some context that's relevant to the debate here is that we have existing structural inequality and injustice. We know that outcomes aren't the same for men and women. We have social and economic policy that's often written for the homo economicus, and I must admit here that I am an economist myself. Excuse me. Sorry about that. But we have policy that's written for male-headed nuclear families still, with this attitude of we add some women and stir. One of the outcomes of this is that we have existing welfare programs that are associated with paid work and labour market activation, and that are ignoring this whole area of care work and household work that's often done, or the majority of it is done by women. Additionally, we have everyone knows about the ongoing gender pay gap that might take 100 years to eliminate, if ever. And this leads to women being seen as the natural choice for stay-at-home carers. There's obviously other things here. I'm going very simply. We also know that women are more likely to be living in poverty, particularly old age poverty, and with pension and saving gaps, or gaps in superannuation. So we have lots of underlying ongoing issues here, many layers, quite complicated, but UBI can definitely be beneficial from a feminist perspective. And a couple of things from a feminist perspective that the literature talks about is this impact for poverty reduction. We give people UBI up to the poverty line or higher, and we can eliminate poverty or definitely reduce it. UBI also has the potential to reduce the sexual division of labour by raising the status of non-waged work, and in the same way dethroning paid labour as the only form of work that matters. When we're paying people, when we're giving people money for nothing, we're able to, I'm preaching to the choir here, but we're able to allow people to do work, do unpaid work, do care work, do volunteer work, have that remunerated and have it appreciated. We also have the possibility of freedom, whether it's from dependence on a male breadwinner or on an employer who provides poor working conditions, and gives us an exit option, whether from that job or whether from an unhappy marriage or relationship. UBI may also encourage men to undertake unpaid care work, and it could have positive psychological impact on women's sense of self and well-being. Now, you can argue that this would also have an impact on men, but this particular study was looking at women who were engaged in a lot of care work, and being paid for that created a greater sense of self and well-being. On the other side, there's a lot of potential for some negative impacts with the basic income, things that we want to analyse from a feminist perspective. So one argument is that the UBI could act as a housewife's wage, and the distribution of unpaid care may not work. So he would be paying women to stay at home and thereby cementing gender asymmetric roles. Of course, women have a choice here. It's not as simple as this, but this is one of the issues that may come up. Funding for UBI, unfortunately, somehow we have to pay for a UBI, so funding may reduce the availability of other support services if we're potentially cutting access to childcare, healthcare services, or public transport. Some of these things might be disproportionately experienced by women. We can also look at the size of the public sector. We know that there's a lot more women working in the public sector because of the more family-friendly policies government positions often offer. So this could also negatively impact a woman's ability to have a family-friendly or a care-friendly employment. Somewhat counterintuitively, Parker has shown that unemployment and poverty traps may be institutionalized if we have income tax-based funding. So it might not eliminate that, but actually institutionalize it. A UBI won't be able to address existing structural inequalities, or won't address the way that we work, or the way that work, paid and unpaid, is structured, how that the 5-day work week, the 4-day work week, etc. Another counterintuitive point is that it may increase dependence on men, and this is definitely a caveat here. Is that this is taken from one experiment, and I know that my colleagues don't all agree with this point. But if women are then becoming carers or taking longer maternity leave, it might lead to increasing dependence on their male partners. Not proven, just a suggestion. Often, if we are paying a basic income and allowing more women to enter the workforce, and I'll talk about this shortly, we might see that the burden of care work is placed on low-income women, women of colour, or migrants. We could also see that a withdrawal from the workforce that is allowed by paying this carer's wage may undo the progress made for women's employment conditions. So these are some of the suspicions. What are some of the potential outcomes of a basic income? What could this do for? How could this affect women when we're looking at it through a feminist lens? I just want to take a step back now and look at sort of the equality that we're aiming to achieve with a basic income. So one of the important debates that comes up is, how do we achieve gender justice or gender equality? And Carol Pateman and Nancy Fraser have summarized this in what's called the Wollstonecraft dilemma. Looking at the argument between equality and difference. Do we treat women equal to men, treating women exactly like men, or are we treating them differently insofar as they differ from men? In terms of equality, that might look like integrating women into the public sphere, so into employment opportunities, working, becoming the breadwinner. In this situation, would see that both men and women are breadwinners, able to enter the workforce. One of the policies this might look like subsidized child and elder care. If we're embracing the indifference approach, which I think aligns with more the second wave feminism, we're looking at promoting equality through the public promotion of informal care work that's usually performed by women. So let's raise up onto a pedestal the unpaid care work that's done, potentially by paying for it. This is what Fraser's calling the caregiver parity model, and this might look like caregiver allowances. As my colleague Almaz Zelleke has argued, and she might speak about this later, neither of these approaches really challenges the idea of being the autonomous independent worker as a model citizen, or recognizes that we can't fully commodify the work, or we can't fully commodify care work. And neither of these approaches is challenging the political economy of capitalism. So the question is, what do we do? One of the answers that Nancy Fraser's come up with is that we need to redistribute all work, paid work and unpaid work, in this universal caregiver model. So having the society built around the idea that all people have caregiving responsibilities. And there's probably some people there in the audience or sitting behind your computers at home thinking like, hey, I am the breadwinner and I am the caregiver. And women have been doing this for a lot of time, and single parents have been doing this for a lot of time, combining breadwinning and caregiving, but with great difficulty and strain. So Fraser's arguing that in a post-industrial welfare state, we need to ensure that men are also doing this. So we're redistributing paid and unpaid work, men's work and women's work, redistributing these while designing institutions so to eliminate the difficulty and strain. Now, coming back to universal basic income, how do we do this? Revisiting our quote from before, my quote, under any imaginable basic income reform, women would benefit far more than men. We don't see this. If we have a low-level basic income that's really insufficient to cover the cost of financing childcare, but we've cut the cost of childcare, we're not going to see women benefiting more. Additionally, if a basic income acts as a care allowance in a political environment which is stripping women of labour rights, we won't see women benefit from having more choices to enter the workforce. And looking at our universal basic income, we've got 5 characteristics according to the BN definitions: periodic, cash payment, individual, universal, and unconditional. We know that all these features have lots of different aspects to them. So UBI is often lauded for its simplicity, but when we're looking at it from a feminist perspective, we have to look a little bit further into how different aspects of a UBI, different characteristics of a UBI might be shaped from a feminist perspective that are meeting some of these feminist goals for equality, enabling women to either enter the workforce or do more care work, or enabling men to do more care work. So it's a lot more complicated than just these 5 characteristics. And a couple of examples I'll pull out, and then I'll leave it to my colleagues to discuss further. But in terms of the goals of a program, often we talk about the goal of UBIs to enhancing freedom, we can say it's an income security policy, or it could be a poverty elimination policy. And while some of the goals and the outcomes might intersect, it's important to think about how the goals of this program will shape the rest of the policy. So particularly for women or for feminists who are looking at a poverty elimination strategy, this is going to change the way that we structure some of the rest of the policy of UBI. Another question that's really important from a feminist perspective is how we're financing a UBI, particularly around opportunity costs. So a UBI funded by cuts to social services such as childcare or healthcare might result in a mother delaying her return to the paid workforce. More in terms of childcare than healthcare there. And this is what scholars talk about, the UBI plus, UBI plus rather than UBI minus. So we want UBI, but we want to have a welfare state. Another question, would UBI would it be implemented at the expense of other social policies? We've seen the relative success of the Scandinavian use it or lose it parental leave policies, where parental leave, it's required that both partners take a chunk of the parental leave. Otherwise, this special period, maybe 3 months, not used by often a father or a secondary carer, would be lost if it wasn't used. So we see how this has had a positive effect of sharing of unpaid care work in Scandinavian countries. I think it's just Sweden and Norway. I think Finland's out of this one, but someone can maybe correct me in the chat there. But if we're having a UBI and saying this is the solution, and we're eliminating other social policies, we're trying to create a market-oriented solution to a bigger gender-related social problem, which would require more social change. So I'll conclude my outline there, and I'll let my colleagues elucidate and add some more voices of women, but hopefully I've been able to give a little bit of a framework of how how feminist lens on UBI can be applied in policy and why it's important. And if you'd like to do some further reading, here we go. So thank you very much, and I'll pass back to Jessie.
so much, Clem, for your presentation. There's so far no questions in the chat, but please, for the people hearing us online, write any questions or comments in the chat. I will then ask the speakers or read them out loud. And so we might have time in the end as well for some questions. If there are not current questions, I would lead to our next presentation from Almaz Zelleke. She's a professor of practice in political science at NYU Shanghai and specializes in UBI, including gender, political theory and public policy, feminist political theory, and comparative political economy. And as we all, is also member of our team UBI and gender at the Freebies. So Almaz, I'm giving you the floor and mute myself now.
Jess. And thank you, Clem, for that excellent literature review on issues related to gender and basic income. I'm going to follow and build on that by talking from a more analytical perspective of some of the key questions and design features that are particularly important to women. And I want to talk particularly about this question of whether a basic income would lead to Nancy Fraser's universal caregiver model, and which involves a more equitable, egalitarian distribution of both paid labor and unpaid care work between the genders, and what role basic income has and what role other social institutions have in bringing that about. So I always like to start any discussion that I'm involved in about basic income with kind of a statement of my goals and understanding of basic income, because they're not shared by everyone universally. And so I particularly believe that from a feminist perspective, the goal of poverty alleviation is key. That's not always a part of everybody's viewpoint on basic income, but I do think it is key for women, because women do bear the burden of both paid labor and unpaid care, and particularly in situations where women are the sole parents, that's a very difficult balance to maintain at a level of sufficiency for themselves and the family. And women's care responsibilities lead to lifelong lower earnings than men, and as Clem said, to increased risk of poverty in old age as well. In addition, I like to go beyond the idea of elimination of poverty. As Jess said in her introduction, we're not just talking about barely scraping by, but we're talking about the elimination of economic insecurity as well. Not as poetic a way of putting that as the term bread and roses, but for my perspective on basic income, we're really looking for something that it does both poverty elimination and increases economic security for all. And the important aspect of basic income for women is not only that it reduces inequality overall and increases life chances, the equitable distribution of life chances for all, but it specifically addresses persistent inequalities between the genders, both on the income and wealth axis, but also in terms of the distribution of paid and unpaid work and socially contributory opportunities. In addition, basic income that is gender inclusive offers the opportunity to have a more solidaristic civic alliance between carers and workers. Often in discussions about social welfare, we see those who are employed in paid labor being set in opposition to those who are not in paid labor. We see this often in discussions, critical discussions of basic income by skeptics or by opponents or by people who believe that everybody should work, that it's important for everybody to participate in civic life by working in paid employment. So basic income from a gender perspective offers a way to reframe that conversation as one of solidarity between both people who work in paid employment and people who do the unpaid care that makes paid employment possible. Moving to the next slide, if I can. So I want to go through each of the characteristics of basic income that Clem mentioned and talk about their practical and symbolic importance to women, and then also highlight key questions that arise from these different factors. So the first is unconditionality. Well, unconditionality is practically important to women because typically what we're talking about is unconditionality on work and paid employment, or willingness to work, or availability to work. And for those who are responsible for unpaid care work in our society, disproportionately women, but not only women, of course, that condition on receipt of income support benefits is one that's hard to meet. Even if carers want to work in part-time work, it doesn't necessarily always align with the hours that they're available. Much work, particularly at the lower end of the income scale these days, is it has unpredictable hours, which is not possible to combine with care responsibilities. The symbolic importance, on the other hand, is that it recognizes unpaid care work as a social contribution on an equal basis with paid employment. And it extends the reciprocity principle, which has often been used in opposition to basic income, to say that if we're going to give people income supports, we're entitled to a reciprocal effort on their part in paid employment. Well, it extends the reciprocity principle to unpaid care as well. We all need to reciprocate, not only for the paid labor that supports our society, but also for the unpaid labor that supports our society. And one way we can do that is by providing income supports to carers as well. So one of the questions that arises from this, as Clem mentioned, is the question of whether a basic income would actually reinforce the gendered division of labor by providing an income to people who engage only in unpaid care and not in paid labor, and whether those choices will be made not on a random basis, but on the basis of gender, reinforcing existing gendered divisions of labor. I'll speak more about that in a moment. Now, the next principle of basic income is the principle of universality. There are really two understandings of universality, and I want to address them both. The first is that basic income would not be targeted to particular demographic groups, such as families, or paid workers, or the unemployed, or the disabled, people who are participating in some socially approved way. I think it's particularly important to reinforce this principle as we see the proliferation of pilots around the world, some of which are targeted to particular demographic groups. So, in this sense, they're not really basic income pilots. They're guaranteed income pilots of a different sort if they're targeted to people who are particularly poor, or who are unemployed, or who have been unable to participate in paid labor for some particular reason. The idea of a basic income is that it's universal. It doesn't make these distinctions between social roles. The second meaning of universality is that it's not strictly targeted to the poor through means testing. This doesn't mean that it can't be income tested in some way, particularly if it's financed by progressive income taxes or progressive wealth taxes. There will be some people who end up under that full benefit and tax regime as net recipients or net payers of a basic income, but it doesn't require people to, in advance of receiving benefits, prove their poverty through very strict means and asset tests. So the universality, the first definition of universality, what is its practical importance to women? Women and others engaged in unpaid care work may be involved, may be part of multiple categories. They may be carers as well as paid laborers, and they may move at different times between those categories over the course of the year. So an income supplement that does not distinguish between these categories makes it much easier for women to access these benefits. They don't come in and out of eligibility over the course of the year. They maintain their eligibility throughout. In addition, those who they care for may not fit squarely into one of these definitions. For example, people, if they're caring for people who have a disability, disabilities are not necessarily all or nothing. They may be caring for people who have some ability to participate in paid labor, but that fluctuates over time or over the course of the year. If their income source is also consistent, that is useful for not only the cared, but also for the caregivers. The more money that's available to both in the caring relationship, the better off they'll be, and the more stable that income that is, the better off they'll be as well. Symbolic importance for women of this first definition of universality is, as I said earlier, that it recognizes care work, and in particular, the second shift of care work, so that even if someone's in paid employment, for women there's often a second shift, or carers in general, a second shift of unpaid care after the workday is over. So one question that this raises is a broadly universal basic income too inclusive? In other words, is it over-inclusive of people who do not perform care? How does this universality square with a desire particularly to recognize unpaid care and caregivers? I'll come back to this in a moment as well. So with the second definition of universality, that it's not means tested and restricted to the poor, again, the practical importance to women is that it can stabilize unstable incomes, which are unstable because they require or they result from a combination of paid labor and unpaid labor, both for the carers and those they care for. And it's particularly important for women to be able to receive an income supplement when they are in a period of their life where they are either caring full-time or are engaged in low-paid paid work, because it allows them to accumulate a little bit of savings over the lifetime and helps to mitigate the lower lifetime earnings of women, not just the lower earnings of women at a particular point in time. Of course, this is more expensive than means-tested programs or programs that are targeted to the poor. So the question this raises is whether a broadly universal basic income will reduce funds for social services, as Clem mentioned. And finally, the individuality of basic income. This one, I think, is particularly important for women as opposed to for basic income recipients in general. It's critically important that basic income benefits be individual and additive, because that allows women to have income security independent of marriage or family status. And the additive nature of an individual benefit, as opposed to one that's scaled down as household size increases, means that people can live together in many different kinds of household formation, including multi-generational households that allow for some sharing of care work and other resources across the generations. So the question that this raises, and I really want to focus on, is what is the interaction of an individual basic income with the individual or household basis of taxation and other benefit programs in a particular tax and benefit regime? Often I think in the basic income debate, we talk a lot about the benefit side, and we don't talk as much about the financing side or the taxation side. And it turns out that this is quite important. So I don't have time to go into too much detail. This is actually the subject of my other paper at this conference, but I just want to spend a little time talking about the difference between household and individual benefits and taxation. And I should say that most of the advanced economies in the world have some form of individualized taxation of married couples, which means that the spouse's income is taxed separately. However, in most countries, there's still some pooling of income and eligibility for many tax credits, deductions, tax benefits, and other benefits for the household. What that means is that there are certain the effects of joint taxation of married couples, which is explicitly still only in a few places, including my home country of the United States, but it's detrimental to women in many ways. Household benefits scaled to household size and income pooled for tax purposes. It's less expensive to provide these benefits, and household economies of scale allow for lower benefit levels and lower cost overall, but there are a number of problems that I've listed here. There's a disincentive to marriage or joint householding due to benefit loss if benefits are not fully individualized. There are increased paid labor incentives for primary or single earner families. due to lower marginal tax rates that they face overall. Paid labor of secondary workers, often the women who earn less because of their care responsibilities, is due to higher marginal tax rates. Their paid labor is disincentivized, and this masks intra-household gender inequalities, whereas individualized benefits and taxes are better for women, but they do cost more. Marriage or joint householding always will increase total resources. Paid labor disincentives for primary workers happen because their taxes increase. Increased paid labor for secondary workers is more likely because their marginal tax rates decrease, and the individualized basis of this accounting reveals intra-household gender inequalities. So let me stop there so that there's time for my other colleagues to continue the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Almaz, for your presentation. So there's still no questions in the chat. I can just remind you all, if you have any questions, you can write them in the chat. I can ask them later. We can save them. But are there any other comments from the other speakers of this panel? You can ask them now as well, or we have a discussion in the end. So if that's not the case for now, I want to introduce our third speaker from this day's panel, Toru Yamamori. He's a professor in economics at Doshisha University in Japan, and he has been working on a philosophical foundation of feminist economics and on our history of the working class women's liberation movement that early demanded UBI in the 1970s in Britain. So, Toru, the stage is yours.
Jessica, thank you for her introduction. And yes, today I'm introducing some forgotten feminist voices for and against basic income. I think one of the virtue of feminism is to look at history, like the author of Bread and Roses, Andrea Detari, did, and try to reclaim forgotten struggle by feminists. And today I am talking some women who are erased from history. They are working class women at the intersection of women's liberation movement and the Clement Union movement in the long 1970s Britain. And there are pros and cons against the demand of basic income by those women by mainstream women's liberationists. So that I would like to introduce both Clement women's voices and mainstream feminists against it. I think I don't need to explain doing mansplaining what women's liberation was, but I think I need to explain what Clement Union was. Clement Union was a union of welfare claimant, and it was first established in Birmingham in 1968, and then a similar attempt was made spontaneously all over the UK, and those unions gathered 2 years later, 1970, and found a national federation, and it had been active until 1987, as far as I can trace. And size of each local Clement Union, the membership is, the smaller one is around 10 and the bigger one is around 400. And the number of unions itself, it's around 90 or 100, almost during the 1970s. And I'd like to emphasize the intersectionality of membership. Majority is working class women, but there are many from different backgrounds. I don't know those labels do justice, but unemployed, strikers, school leavers, disabled, abled, transgender, cisgender, women, men, white, black, Asian, native, immigrant, working class, middle class, etc. And that National Federation has a charter, and first of which is the right to adequate income without means test for all people. And they collectively articulated its idea of unconditional basic income, drawing broader concepts of guaranteed income. In 1970s, this is lower left on the figure, minimum income guarantee, and lower right, UBI. The both are not exactly distinguished each other in 1970s. The both are called interchangeably minimum income or basic income or guaranteed income. And those Clement Union people use the term guaranteed income or guaranteed minimum income, but they articulate it should be this universal model, lower right. This one is exactly the same as what now we call universal basic income. And they, especially women in the Clement Union, made a feminist case for UBI and succeeded to make it an official demand of the British women's liberation movement, but sadly erased from history. So I'm going to show testimony, and based on my oral historical research, this is Sue, this is Pat, this is Susan and her son Spencer, and from left this is Joe, Julia, Jane, Jenny, and John. And from right, this is another Sue and Julia again, and Maria and Valerie, and some other people. And I'm going to show some testimony. This is the left. This is Margaret Tiller. And when I asked her why you demanded basic income, and her reply is because it's good for people. And this is Jane again, and when I asked a question about basic income, she recalled as such. When I first came across the topic, it was called guaranteed adequate income. I thought it was a great idea because there's so much bureaucracy in the system. We just thought it was a good idea. Everybody understood child benefit, so it was like child benefit. The Right to Work campaign was going on at the same time, and people in the Clement Union felt quite strongly it wasn't the answer. We don't want the right to be exploited. And yes, and their demand were, I think Clem and Almaz mentioned about Nancy Fraser, and but Nancy Fraser's proposal that those Clement women prefigure it. So I show some testimony. It was on the pamphlet. It was probably written by Julia, by the way. No women should be man's housekeeper or au pair. Being given a wage for this will merely institutionalize this disgusting situation. Instead, we must organize our lives in such a way as to have a real choice. We must each be free to decide what to do and to obtain satisfaction out of work. This means organizing playgroups and outings. It means babysitting rotas, housework, and shopping rotas. It might even mean everyone in the home putting his income and sharing it among us equally. In turn, this might mean the end of the nuclear family and the end of the head of the household. This might mean liberation for millions of women, liberation from the drudgery of housework and childcare. And those women thought with basic income, we can go forward for this direction. So, yes, Nancy Fraser proposed the universal caregiver model as her own, but a decade before her, those working class women advocated the same. And also, unconditionality, what they understood came from their attempt to have unconditional solidarity. Lynn Boyd and Annette Mackey told me their struggle in the Clement Union, from everyday struggle to the demand for the basic income, it taught us how to work together with other people to support without prejudice. It's about actually thinking about other people as well as yourself and actually trying to develop the community which is good for your kid. And Julia Mayne-Waring said, we reiterate that we support all claimant without condition. This unconditional solidarity resonate with the articulation of unconditional basic income. Also, they prefigure we might call now a responsible production. In their document, pamphlet, they say a lot of jobs people were doing are socially useless, advertising and making cosmetics. Some jobs are positively harmful, for example, making weapons, being a soldier. So in order to be free from those toxic industry, we need a basic income. That's their demand. Also, they said we should be organizing toward control not only of the workplace, but also of what is produced there. There seemed little point in demanding workers control factory building Concordo or shipyard building warships for the fascist government. The trade union movement must challenge more direct the nature of employment and work in this society. Also, they said basic income confront so-called rationalization policy at the time in attacking the whole scale of values based on productivity and profitability and counterposing it with values based on social need. And it attacks the definition of productive. It often comes down to productivity for its own sake to keep the old production, consumption, profit cycle going. Women at home, bringing up kids, frame and working in the community are creative and productive, but not regarded by them. Them means establishment, including feminists and trade unionists in the mainstream. The perspective given by basic income demand is educative. So, women in the Clement Union put their demand to the National Women's Liberation Conference, and the resolution was passed with majority vote, and it was recorded in the feminist magazine, Spare Rib, but almost the time it was passed, it starts to be erased. And now we have many historiography and memoir and British second wave feminism and women's liberation, and it record 7 demands which was passed as a resolution in women's liberation conferences, and from number 1 to number 7, but there are no basic income is recorded. Those women, like Julia and Jane, they went to the Women's Liberation Conference and made the resolution passed. They asked whole British women's liberation movement to support the demand for basic income, but it was not recorded. Either it should have been recorded at number 6, or sub-demand or developed demand from number 5, but neither didn't happen. I don't have to give everything, but Julia recalls the reason why it was erased. Middle-class women didn't understand what the hell goes on with the idea of basic income, and the chair of plenary session of the Women's Liberation Conference just thought we are scam. She didn't see us as a part of the working class, rather below the working class. So I couldn't reach that chair, so that I cannot verify this testimony, but at least she thought there are class divide and class prejudice. So again, this testimony come back to the subject of Andrea de Taris and the Bread and Rose intersection of class and gender. And yes, so now let me move to testimony against basic income. Again, I'm running out of time, so I just selectively pick some word. So this is by Mary McIntosh, leading socialist feminist. Leading feminist at this time, and later became a professor in academia, and also the key person for making that fifth demand I explained a few back slide. And it said basic income is really a utopian demand. It's a socialist demand. So its proponents are well aware unrealizable demand and the capitalism is so radical to be actualized in the capitalist system. And people in the Clement Union have been sadly deceived. That's her judgment. And another leading feminist at the time, Michelle Barrett, she wrote, the Clement Union support for basic income has been criticized as tending to reinforce women's role in the household and as not providing a fundamental challenge to the state assumption concerning women's dependence. It's quite ironic that Mary McIntosh criticized it as too utopian, and Michelle Barrett said it doesn't provide fundamental challenge, so it's quite opposite. But anyway, the reception of Clement Union's women's basic income is quite negative in the women's liberation movement at the time and just forgotten and erased. But there are also kind of mediating voice. There are many people who didn't know there are such a demand and made by the working class women and erased by middle class women. But encountering women's liberation movement as a whole, and with that, some people reach individually to the idea of basic income. I couldn't have I don't have time to read it, but Ursula Hughes, one of the leading feminists now, was a participant in the women's liberation movement, and she didn't know Clement women and their demand, but with that women's liberation movement, she kind of reached the concept of universal basic income, and now she's supporting this idea. Yes, and I'm running a type, so instead of concluding, let me introduce recent voice. As some of you might know, Hawaii State Commission of the Status of Women published spring of 2020 feminist recovery plan, feminist economic recovery plan for COVID-19. There is a basic income in that plan. And the key person reflect like this. Some of the key elements are the full economic self-sufficiency regardless of the work. And this sounds really neutral at first, but if you think about it, many of us, especially women with disability, women who are caregiving and don't have the same ability, access employment, and will never have the same value as workers. And so making sure that universal basic income, which has been a long intergenerational rallying cry for feminists, is at the center was really important. So their struggle is somehow not recorded in a good way in academia, but somehow torch is passing to the current generation. So thank you very much. I give the floor back to Jessica.
Thank you, Toru, so much for your presentation, especially like showing the interlace of class and gender in the history of women's liberation movement. We had one question in the chat for Almaz, which I will ask in the end, but it's not overseen. And I will now pass to our last speaker of this session, Chloe Halpenny. She's a social policy researcher and evaluator and co-chair and co-founder of the Basic Income Canada Youth Network and currently a PhD student at the Queen's University. In her master's research at the University of Cambridge, she leveraged participant experiences in the Ontario Basic Income pilot to explore basic income through a feminist lens. And I will give to Chloe now for her presentation.
Thanks, Jesse. And yeah, thanks to everyone else who went before me. The best part about going at the end, and I say this seriously, is that there's not that much left to say. I feel like so much has been said, but I will go through my slides pretty quickly and just try to sort of fill in, not even gaps per se, but just sort of add on some of the great things my colleagues have shared already. But as Jesse shared, I did my master's research on the Ontario Basic Income Pilot, and I'm going to be sharing in just a couple of slides some of the things that came out from participants that kind of allude to or shed light on what a feminist, quote unquote, basic income might look like, and getting at some of those things around questions of design and principles and values and characteristics. So I'm really just hoping to demonstrate how some of these things that underpin the design of a basic income can play out on the ground, and how this informs and or complicates feminist perspectives. And again, I'll go fairly quickly, but can share slides or go back after if we have time. So what I've done is just sort of gone through my data and pulled quotes specifically from women participants in the Ontario Basic Income Pilot, and trying to really flesh out some of those characteristics that were described to me as particularly important or relevant to folks as women receiving that money. So the first is reliability and predictability. I would also add, hearing my colleagues speak, regularity. So the confidence in when the payment was coming and the amount that they were going to be getting really supported women to be able to plan ahead, to actually start to build some savings, and really reduce stress. So just the knowledge and security of money coming at a regular interval and a known amount. So from here, we've got one quote: "I got the check at the same time every month. It was consistent. The money was stable. That's really all I need." It's really all I needed for peace of mind, is just a stable income. That was enough to live on. And comparing that really to the provincial disability assistance program she was currently on, where it's not stable because you live with this fear that they can revoke it any time. The second one, and this really came up pretty universally across folks that I spoke with, and Toru and I spoke a bit more about this, I would say, on a panel this morning, but was this idea of amount and adequacy. So what really came out of my data was that in order to achieve gender-based and other outcomes, the amount of a basic income must be sufficient. So a lot of the things that we think about as being sort of desirable feminist outcomes for a basic income, whether that's autonomy or dignity or independence or what have you, are all really closely and intimately connected to that benefit being an adequate amount. And especially for women experiencing poverty, the stability offered via an independent income is crucial. So we have a quote here saying, "As a female, a mom who's experienced a lot of hardship in my work in male-dominated abusive environments, basic income is definitely empowering. It's freeing, and I believe it may be one of the keys to helping people who are in abusive relationships." So we often think about basic income from a feminist perspective as sort of offering an exit option. But really, I think, heard that in order for something to be in order for basic income to viably offer an exit option, it needs to be enough to allow people to exit. Next was around this idea of stigma. And by this, I really mean, how is a basic income imagined and designed in a way to reduce stigma? So folks that I spoke with had varying experiences of stigma through basic income. So some, particularly people who had previously been on provincial social assistance or kind of welfare programs, felt that basic income had been a major improvement. But things like had the extent to which the benefit was anonymous, whether in people's minds, like socially, a basic income was viewed as sort of an extension of welfare or something different, as well as how people were able to spend that money. So people felt that they experienced stigma when they had to say no to something that they would have otherwise wanted to spend money on. So again, that's sort of connected to this idea of amount. And really sort of some of these ideas of where gender and class stereotyping and stigma overlap. So this idea of being kind of a quote unquote welfare mom, or all of these ideas where stigma and stereotypes from various places sort of came together, and basic income interplayed with that. So quote here saying, when this person returned to the disability assistance program from the basic income pilot, saying, I realized that all of a sudden I didn't feel like the same person I was yesterday. And my brain was like, you're the same person, you're still doing the same things, but it's that label that's completely different. The difference between an entrepreneur and disabled is so different. I'm still a businesswoman. My brain knows there's no difference, but my heart hurt. Next, we've got this idea of a basic income being framed as rights-based, so kind of connected to this idea of stigma, but the framing and perception of the benefit as a right versus a gift or a handout was key. And our participants saying things like, yes, I did understand this to be a right because everybody should have the right to live in dignity. And I have the right to be able to provide my daughter with a safe home. And when I'm stressed at work and when I'm experiencing abuse, that right is taken away from me. So really, framing it as something as a right. And I think this was especially the case in Ontario. When I was speaking with folks, it was right when people were receiving their last payments following the pilot's abrupt and early cancellation. So I think this idea of not being able to be taken away was really top of mind for people. Just a couple more. So complementarity, this has come up, I think everyone's mentioned this in a couple of different ways, but while the receipt of a basic income was really widely described as life-changing, women I spoke with also highlighted just how important it was that be complemented by other social programs and supports, many of which are still lacking here in Canada. So things like universal dental and pharmacare, childcare, affordable housing. There were some challenges for people who were switching from previous assistance programs in terms of transferring medication, prescription payment, as well as dental support. Fun fact, universal healthcare in Canada doesn't cover either of those things. So these ideas of basic income is great, but on its own, it actually isn't enough. And had a couple people say, if I didn't receive ongoing support as a result of living in poverty from the government in terms of prescription coverage, basic income wouldn't have actually made me any better off just because of the cost of my prescriptions every month. And a good quote at the bottom there pointing to the importance of housing, I think. So someone saying the consequences of not having basic income are very different than for men. When you look at homelessness, I've had points in my lives where I've called rooming houses and the landlords have said outright they won't take me because it's not safe for a female to be in a rooming house. Next is this idea of targeting, which I know is a bit of a Canadian specific context piece and a little controversial, but when advocates in Canada are speaking about a basic income, most commonly we are talking about something that is income tested and not universally delivered to everybody. And this was something that was really articulated by folks I spoke with as well, who pretty widely shared the belief that the benefit should be targeted and delivered on the basis of need, and this really being framed as a question of fairness. Also heard about the importance of a basic income to the extent that it could addressing diverse needs. So for instance, the Ontario pilot gave a $500 monthly top-up to disabled participants, which was pretty widely recognized, I think, as something that was important that it did. Benefit calculation and administration. So this is more of Almaz's boat than mine for sure, but perceptions about benefit administration were mixed. And by this, I'm talking both about how income was calculated for the purposes of eligibility, as well as how the benefit was delivered on an individual or household basis. And heard about, I think, income being calculated on a household basis. We've got a quote from one person here saying, with my husband, I have to make sure it's good for both of us. His GIS, which is a benefit delivered to low-income seniors in Ontario, amounts really kind of drag me down. I have to be able to make enough money to increase the fact that we might not get as much money as a couple. So really having to navigate household income for her individual receipt of a basic income. And then lastly, this idea of unconditionality. So the fact that the basic income in Ontario was entirely unconditional was arguably one of the most significant characteristics to folks I spoke with, particularly those who had previously received social assistance and not having to fulfill conditions like looking for a job, volunteering, participating in training, and also not feeling the sort of stress and power imbalances of negotiating and navigating, dealing with caseworkers and bureaucracy on an ongoing basis. So whoever invested in this program invested in me, that I could do it. I don't have anybody looking over their shoulder, filling out 2 pieces of paper for bus tickets. So a couple of key takeaways, and then I'll wrap us up and hand it back to Jessica. All basic incomes aren't created equally. I think maybe that goes back to the quote that Clem shared at the beginning. And really, I think some of these quotes that I've pulled out demonstrate that the characteristics and principles underpinning the design of a basic income are pretty likely, if not definitely, going to have considerable effects on if and how women benefit, as well as sort of the effects in terms of outcomes related to gender equality more broadly. So I think many of us knew that already, but the experiences of the folks that I spoke with really kind of underscored that. So thank you so much. Sorry that we ran a little bit late, and I'm also sorry that I'm sick and I feel like my voice sounds like a sick person voice. So I will hand it back to Jessica, and thanks for letting me chat.
Thank you so much, Chloe, for your presentation. And yes, now I would want to encourage you again to write your questions in the chat if you have any, for all speakers, and invite, of course, the other speakers of our agenda team to give their comments or questions. But first I want to start with a question to Almaz from John Baker, who's asking, what are your answers to your cues? So I mute myself and give the floor to Almaz again.
Yes. Yeah, thanks, John, for the question. I was running short of time, and I didn't want to take time away from my fellow panelists, so I didn't answer the questions, but I'm glad to have an opportunity to do so now. So questions 1 and 4 were really about whether the basic income would reinforce the gendered distribution of labor between men and women by providing an income for unpaid care, maybe decreasing the need for carers to go out into the paid marketplace. Well, recent research that I presented in my other paper at the Vienna Congress really demonstrates that the primary influence on whether women supply paid labor in advanced economies has to do with the taxation system, specifically whether the system of income taxation is individualized for married couples or household based or couples based. And that's because when it's individualized, each earner gets the benefit of the zero tax bracket, often called the standard deduction or the personal exemption, for the first bracket of their income, and then the lower tax brackets as their income is low, which rise as income increases when couples are taxed on a joint basis. What that means is the primary earner has already kind of used up those zero rates and lower rates before the secondary income is put on top. So the secondary income is being taxed at the highest marginal rates of the primary earner. So this is the system in place now as a result of 2017 law under the Trump administration in the United States. And so, it might be seen as just an American problem. In fact, many European and other advanced economies, including Australia and New Zealand, have more individualized tax systems. But really, it's not just a one or the other situation. There's kind of a spectrum, a range between individualized and joint taxation in most countries as a result not only of the tax specifically on the earned income, but also on other tax-based benefits, deductions, allowances, etc., and also importantly on benefits that are provided to people on a household basis. So what what the research literature really shows is that there are different incentives and disincentives all throughout the sort of the income levels, what we might call different classes. For working class people, often there are disincentives to marry or come together and join households because people will lose benefits that are means tested, that are directed to the poor when they join together and their household income increases. Whereas at the higher end, the primary effect is a secondary earner disincentive. And this has been demonstrated through economic modeling to show that if we shift from joint taxation of married couples to individualized taxation of married couples, we can expect women's paid labor supply to increase, and in many cases, men's paid labor supply to decrease because their taxes become higher on their income. So what I want to suggest by this is that this concern that basic income will reinforce the gender distribution of labor actually overlooks the fact that what we have already in place is what is in many countries disincentivizing married women's paid labor force participation. So we could see paid labor force participation rates increase if we moved from joint taxation to fully individualized taxation of married couples, as we have, for example, in Sweden, which is one of the highest rates of women's labor force participation. And then the second question was whether the a basic income that is universal is too inclusive. If one of our goals, one of our feminist goals, is to recognize unpaid care work, why would we want to extend the basic income to people who are not taking on any care responsibilities, not taking on any employment responsibilities, maybe sitting in their homes all day long, doing something that is not socially productive, or at least is not seen as socially productive. And I think the way to mitigate that is to make sure that the basic income goes not only to caregivers, but also to the people who are being cared for. That increases the resources that are available in that caring relationship, so that there might, a universal basic income still goes to everyone, but the amount of resource increase that will be felt by caregivers will be higher if the people they're caring for, children, the elderly, also get a basic income. And in many countries that can be in the form of either a decent basic pension or a child allowance, both of which we lack in the United States. And then finally, the question 3 was about whether a basic income, a universal, unconditional, individual basic income, which is more expensive than its either conditional, targeted, or household-based variants, it's more expensive, and so will that crowd out social services? And I think the question, the point is, feminists have to demand that it doesn't, because if we take money away from social services to provide a basic income, we're just, in a sense, taking money out of one pocket of women and putting it in the other pocket of women. What we really want to do is take money out of the pockets of men and out of the people who benefit from the employment system that we have now, capitalists, and put that in the hands of people who have fewer resources than they need to live a decent life. So I hope that's answered the questions. Thank you.
Almaz. That would be such a nice last sentence for this session, but there are still other questions, of course. Another one from John Baker to Chloe. Any responses from your participants to the 50% withdrawal rate for income earners? So are there any responses?
And I was just doing a quick look to make sure I was going to give the best answer for this, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to right now, because several people talked about the withdrawal rate, but mostly in the context of it being a lot better than Ontario Works and ODSP, and I actually think that they were the same. It may have been that the income floor for the Ontario pilot was higher, so that people didn't hit that until, that it took longer for people to hit that before they started being clawed back. That could, or I'm also wondering whether, because the pilot was cut short, whether clawbacks happened or whether it would have been the next year. I don't think this is making sense, which is why I was like, oh no, maybe I should be writing out a response, because what I heard by and large was that people felt that it was a lot better, and that there was far less of a work disincentive for people who were choosing to work for like far less amount of time. But I haven't dug into that as much as I am maybe thinking that I should now, reading your question. I don't know if that made sense.
Maybe, yes, maybe we can just continue, and if there's any re-question for you, Chloe, I will read it. We have another question, anonymous. I just will read it. What are panel speakers' response to conspiracy theories who say a UBI will entrench state corporate control and attach conditions to UBI payments that will be a pittance, the main condition being that citizens must not raise questions or dissent? So I think this question goes to all speakers. Should I read it again, or someone want to answer this question?
I can try to answer it if no one else has a has a better response than what I will give. I mean, I think it depends on the kind of political system that we're talking about. If we're talking about a democracy, then we have to demand that this is not the case. We have to demand that the basic income not be a pittance, and we have to demand that it be unconditional. But I think that speaks to what I think we need to be doing in the basic income movement now, which is doing a little bit of less talking about basic income in general, and really talking about what it looks like in a particular country. So, just for example, on the last issue of the 50% withdrawal rate for basic income, that's potentially, I take it as potentially being contemplated in the Canadian system, which is sort of willing to compromise on the question of universality or means test in order to get a basic income passed. I think each country, the basic income advocates in each country need to really look at the context of the country and decide what first steps or incremental steps will lead to the most robust and generous basic income over time. And I don't think that's a question that we can answer in general. I think that's really context specific.
May I, if anyone, if no anyone there? Jessica?
Oh, there was, you can, sorry.
Well, I don't know exactly which conspiracy theory this question refer to, but the danger of being used, the basic income being used as a pittance and silence people, it can be, there are such a fear, and there are something reasonable context in each country, I think. For example, so-called neoliberal version of basic income, the introduction of basic income is coming with dismantling the existing other social security and social services, and also the deregulation of the labor market and abolition of minimum wages. And in that kind of plan and proposal and politics could work as such. So that, yes, there are such kind of danger. Well, I'm quite ignorant about conspiracy theories, but
we have a follow-up question, actually. Again, what is your response to job guarantee advocates who oppose UBI, and to those who say all people only have dignity by working in a master-servant employment contract, a job, also noting doctrines like dignity through work? It's again to all speakers, I think.
so again, may I? Well, instead of answering my own answer, but from the voices from the working class feminists, which I am doing oral history, at that time the mainstream trade unionists demanded for right for work, but employment union women didn't like the idea of right to work. It can be right to be exploited, and in that kind of right to work or at least job guarantee, there are no appreciation of other social participation from unpaid work to some voluntary things in the community, and so the I think the job guarantee cannot be the answer to this kind of question raised by feminists. But yes, for some people, how to say, uh, recognition by gaining employment or some kind of work is quite vital, and basic income advocate should properly hear those voices as well. That's my answer.
I can add to that just because my response to job guarantee advocates who oppose basic income is usually an angry one. Because yeah, I think that this person has pointed out, things about, job quality and whether work is the only place you can get dignity. I spoke with people who had, because they had the security of a basic income, were able to leave jobs that were unsafe with employers who were abusive, that posed risks to their health, and who said to me pretty much like, I actually don't think that job was offering me any dignity. I think that it gave me asthma and made me stressed to go to work or whatever. I also think, specifically in the research I did, I spoke with a lot of people who were disabled and who were receiving disability benefits, and who either weren't able to work or who were only able to work if it was within a job that allowed them to work a limited number of hours and a lot more flexibly. And I had one participant who, basically said to me exactly that, who said, I know that I'm supposed to find dignity through work, but what if I can't work? So my response is usually, yeah, I think to the job guarantee question, to think about what about what types of work do you think offer dignity that other things can't offer, but also how that actually tracks with people for whom engagement in the formal paid labor market isn't an option. I find that there's often some pretty ableist underpinnings to some of those discussions. So yeah.
You, Chloe. Thank you again for emphasizing as well the intersectionality in that case of feminism, and as an answer to what is actually a job and what is dignified work, which not has to be like a master servant employment contract, as the person who raised the question wrote in brackets. Does anyone else want to answer to this question or add something to this discussion?
Yes, I would just add that I think our whole panel is a response to that question, right? A challenge to the idea that is really male-centric, that paid employment is the marker of social citizenship. I think that's what all of the voices that we've heard from Toru and Chloe's work suggests, is that women who have care responsibilities are already working. It's just not paid labor, and that should be socially recognized, and that's what feminists demand. Feminists demand that work be socially recognized as well as paid labor. The foundation of paid labor is unpaid labor and unpaid care, and that needs to be socially recognized.
Thank you, Almaz. I think Toru also said in his presentation, or quoted someone saying that what is actually the definition of productivity, and how is work linked to productivity, and what kind of productivity? And actually there is another question for Toru from John Baker. This last question raises the question Toru quotes Maureen McIntosh on, namely whether a real freedom to avoid exploitation is compatible with capitalism. Is it? So maybe Toru, do you want to ask, or someone else want to answer this question?
To be frank, to be honest with you, I'm struggling to find the answer to this question. I ask myself more than a decade, and I don't have an answer. John or any of panelists would educate me. But just
I
think, well, I don't know, the introduction of basic income would really could give us real freedom, which I don't know. But I believe if the basic income and type we are discussing here in this session, if that kind of basic income would be introduced with other progressive policies, it would increase our freedom, if not real freedom, which someone defined.
And if I could just add that I think when we talk about capitalism, we're talking about a lot of different things, and I think this discussion really centers around that the fact that capitalism allows, or our current capitalist systems in much of the world allow for unlimited accumulation of capital and power, economic power on the part of small numbers of people in the population. So any policy that redistributes some of that power away from that small minority to the larger working class, by which I mean both people who engaged in paid labor and unpaid labor, rebalances some of that power differential. So we don't necessarily have to, I think, eliminate private ownership in the means of production in order to redistribute some of the economic power that our current capitalist systems concentrate in the hands of a few.
Anyone would like to add something to this? Because since there are 3 minutes left, somebody wants to add something, or another quick question maybe. If not, I just would thank you all. So thank you, Clem, thank you, Almaz, thank you, Toru, and thank you, Chloe, for your presentations. And of course, thanks all the participants and people who asked questions and participated in the discussion for your participation.